Hi and welcome to the Geek Legion of Doom. This is a fantasy movie review and I'll be having a look at Crimson Throne, which is also known as Crimson Winter. Now this is a bit of a strange movie to describe. The man behind it's a guy called Bryan Ferriter, and he's written, directed and actually stars in this movie. And basically what you've got with this film is kind of two sort of storylines that sort of merge into sort of one towards the end really. And we have an extended prologue basically sort of showing us this kind of medieval sort of setup, and there's this sort of vampire civil war brewing ultimately, and the kind of the main sort of character, I suppose, this guy called Elric, who is played by Bryan Ferriter, who looks a lot like Rob Lowe, I have to say. Anyway, and basically it's starting with this kind of the war between sort of France and England ultimately, and Eric kind of wants to sort of try and unite humanity in the sort of the vampire race as sort of kind of one sort of united force, and ultimately this sort of turned into a civil war within his kind of own family, namely with his sort of brother ultimately, and kind of ends up in a kind of vampire civil war. So we have this kind of extended sort of prologue at the beginning of the movie, and throughout the film it kind of goes back in flashback, showing, you know, basically stuff that happened sort of in the past, including his Elric's kind of love. He gets this Isabel, who is basically a human woman. I think he sort of meets in the sort of 1700s. Now, running alongside this, we have the kind of the modern day storyline, where a group of sort of university students are basically sort of going to investigate this kind of like snowy wilderness area where there seems to be this kind of a great number of kind of animals that are mysteriously dying, and of course this is going to be down to vampires, as you probably can guess. And inevitably they sort of run into sort of said vampires, and it ends up of course being Elric and his sort of soldiers, who are sort of still sort of trying to sort of hide out and kind of wage their sort of civil war with his brother. Now it's kind of, I say, it's an odd film because a lot of it is actually in flashback. I'd say maybe a third of this film is actually sort of told in flashback, and the other two-thirds, I say, are modern times. But to be honest, it's a kind of a bit of a confused type style of film of what it's actually supposed to be. Like I said, I mean, I best describe it as a kind of fantasy. It's not really a horror film, even though it's sort of a vampire movie, but I guess you could call it more of a almost a vampire drama. It's kind of in the vein of these sort of more gothic Interview with the Vampire, very sort of softly spoken and romanticised sort of ideals of vampires. But I have to say, I think this movie could do with a bit more of a focus of what it's actually trying to be, because unfortunately it comes across just a little bit boring. It's a very, very talky film. There's lots of talking, and to be honest, if you're looking at it from the kind of the modern sort of the modern sort of characters and they're kind of these students, we don't really need to know all of this kind of vampire subplot. All we need to know is obviously there's some vampires out in the kind of the wilderness ultimately, and it really doesn't matter to these guys ultimately, you know, what these vampires have come from. It's kind of it almost seems unnecessary, because the vampire sort of civil conflict isn't resolved in this movie, so it doesn't really matter, you know, about all of this kind of backstory. So it kind of makes it a bit pointless. It almost feels like it should have been sort of two separate films. Ultimately, we've got to have this kind of time-spanning sort of vampire sort of civil war, and that could have completely sort of cut out all these sort of modern sort of bits, and ultimately just focused on the kind of the sort of civil war, and or have this sort of modern film where we have these sort of college kids ultimately sort of run into these vampires, and yet give them a little bit of backstory, but we don't need as much. Unfortunately, it makes the film just a little bit. You're thinking, why is it you're watching these kind of these scenes? They really don't amount to anything. A couple of good things I'll say about this movie. I think that, as I mentioned, it's obviously the main backdrop here. This sort of snowy wilderness. I believed it was filmed in Montana. Anyway, it kind of looks very nice. The sort of scenery is, you know, looks really great. It's obviously a snowy background, and you know, it does make for kind of a bit more of I guess a unique setting for a kind of vampire movie. So it kind of looks very nice, and I think there's some interesting characters. I think Elric himself, who is the lead vampire, is an interesting character, if a little bit mopey and kind of brooding. He pretty much seems to brood pretty much the entire movie, but him in himself is an interesting character, and this is what I mean. It would have been nice maybe just to have the film focus on him instead of even having these kind of college kids in there. Just seems to be a bit of a mixed message. On to the actual acting themselves, I have to say it was pretty poor. This is obviously a kind of a low budget, sort of more of an amateur effort. The most part, I would say the acting is fairly poor, with the exception of Bryan Ferriter himself as Elric, who I thought was quite good and, as I say, made an interesting character. And one of the actual sort of the university kids, I think the character's name was Will, who is kind of the best friend of the main college guy, if you like, is probably the best actors and the most interesting characters out of them. But the rest of the cast, unfortunately, are very sort of amateur style actors. You know, you're very kind of overacting in a sort of, you know, just being far too sort of melodramatic, sort of snarling and kind of grimacing in front of the camera. And on that subject, this is one of those films that really bugs me with vampire films, where people constantly have to sort of feel they have to show their fangs. You know, if you see it a lot of time, especially low budget vampire films, they're kind of wearing these fangs and they constantly feel they've got to kind of bear them all the time, and they just wouldn't do that. If these creatures had fangs and it was kind of their sort of natural way, they wouldn't feel the need to keep sort of like just opening their lips to sort of show their fangs all the time. It's almost to say, look, we've got special effects here, we've got fake fangs, check them out. Well, I think if we just sort of saw them, just if they sort of spoke normally, or just kind of act, it just kind of be a bit more obvious, a bit less obvious, but more natural. So it came across as a kind of a sort of an amateur effort. The choreography as well is pretty poor. There's lots of kind of shaky cam and sort of close up in regard to the action scenes. There isn't a hell of a lot of fighting involved. Like I said, it's obviously a low budget film. The kind of the earlier scenes where we sort of see the sort of the medieval bits, you know, well, I guess we're meant to believe it's obviously this sort of big battle. The kind of got sound effects that kind of fool us into thinking that we're in the kind of midst of this big battle, but it's obviously about 4 or 5 guys just kind of fighting, and the sort of camera's obviously sort of very fixed in and stuff like that. But you're going to get like people getting sort of stabbed, and they're obviously kind of the sword is just going to their side, and as they pull out, there's no blood on it and things like that. There's not a lot of gore in it. There's a few sort of scenes obviously where the vampires are sort of drinking blood and it's sort of going down their faces and things like that. But there's not a particularly you know, a lot of gore here. I think there's some interesting ideas to this movie. I think it would have been better off having focusing on one narrative or another. I don't know if it's intending to kind of, I mean, the way it ended, I won't go into what happens at the end. I think maybe it's trying to kind of set itself up for you know, another film after this. I personally feel it would have been better off sort of either having it in, you know, one film set in kind of, you know, past times, maybe, or have just more of a straight horror film sort of set in the kind of more contemporary area. But unfortunately, as it is, I think it's a little bit confused and it comes across as a little bit boring. But at the same time, it's being boring, the plot doesn't make a lot of sense either. So I'm going to have to give this movie a 4 out of 10. I can see some good ideas here, and as I say, I think it looks fairly pretty, and there are some interesting characters. But overall, as a movie, it isn't a particularly enjoyable film to watch. Have you seen it? What do you think of it? Leave me a comment. I will look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.